Good afternoon. Whether someone is insane at the time of a crime doesn't hinge on the enormity of the tragedy. And there's no doubt that this case involves sadness beyond comprehension. These children should not have died driving home from a fun night at a concert. It's not just, it's not fair, it's nothing but a complete and utter tragedy. But as you all promised in voir dire, your verdict must be based upon an application of the law in Vermont of diminished capacity and insanity, not on your perfectly natural and human sympathy for the victims and their families. And the evidence is clear. Mr. Bourgoin was insane at the time of the offense. So what's this case about? This case is about Stephen Bourgoin's state of mind at the time of the crashes. What in the world was he thinking when he roared up French Hill and crashed into the car? And then stealing a police car, driving away, turning around, driving back at 100 miles an hour and crashing back into the original scene. What would possess him to do such a thing? It's really the only issue you have to decide. If he did it because he was in some type of suicidal rage, determined to die in a spectacular crash and take out as many people as he could with him, then he's guilty of everything. But that's not what happened. The evidence, when viewed critically and objectively, points to a different conclusion. The result was the same. There's no denying that or changing that. But Stephen Bourgoin wasn't suicidal. He wasn't rageful. He was psychotic. So let's first go through the evidence presented by the state during their case in chief to determine what parts of it may be of some assistance to you in figuring that out, whether or not he's guilty of second-degree murder. If he didn't know he was driving the wrong way, or he knew but didn't actually appreciate and disregard the riskiness of that behavior for any reason whatsoever, he's not guilty of second-degree murder. In that case, you would either move to a consideration of involuntary manslaughter. So the judge will instruct you of two equally important things with regard to a consideration between second-degree murder and involuntary manslaughter. And that's one, if you're trying to decide whether it's second-degree murder or involuntary manslaughter, if you reach an impasse with that, you can go down to the other one before trying to reach a verdict. And the other, we talked about this in voir dire, is that there's a presumption of the lesser. As to how the presumption of innocence, if you remember, we talked about this, comes into play in a case like this. So what evidence did the state present during its case in chief about what Mr. Bourgoin was thinking back on October 8th? The state presented 31 witnesses in 4 days the first week of trial. I would submit only about a dozen of those have anything to say about what was going on with Mr. Bourgoin. The first witness, Chris Page, he says that his truck, Mr. Bourgoin's truck, was parked at his home at 5:30 and drove off aggressively at 11:30. He had never seen him drive like that before. And he left, he came back, and then he left again. He also says, remember this testimony, that Mr. Bourgoin's truck, he heard it going on and off and coming and going all through the night, 2-3 times during the night, between Friday night and Saturday night. Now, David Kelleher, he started seeing Mr. Bourgoin going the right way, but then he sees him stop and do this K-turn on the interstate, and he thought it was odd, but also thought it was a person just getting off the interstate. Again, on his face, it's helpful to the state. Ms. George told you that. I mean, who doesn't know they're going the wrong way on the interstate when you make a three-point turn in the middle of the interstate? But does it help you determine whether Mr. Bourgoin was psychotic or not? He's driving around. If he's driving around following clues by the radio, you heard Cy Ray talk about him going down a road on Friday during the day and making an abrupt turn, driving down the road turning around and making an abrupt turn. He's confused, he's psychotic, he's delusional. Is this how people get on the interstate? If you're intentionally trying to get on the interstate the wrong way, is this how you do it? You get on the right way and then turn around? Or do you just get on the off-ramp or off the on-ramp? Then there are the people that Mr. Bourgoin passes along the way as he's driving the wrong way on the interstate. Again, the state's argument is, well, he should have known. But if he thinks he's driving on a road and not the interstate, he's in the right lane. If you're from Mr. Bourgoin's perspective, he's staying right in the right lane, and cars are passing him in the opposite direction, as they would on any road. So he is driving down the right side. They all say that very clearly. He is in the right lane, he's staying in the right lane, and importantly, he's not trying to hit us. He's going right by us, each one of them. If he's in some type of suicidal rage or fit, why isn't he plowing into them? Why isn't he plowing into the first car he sees? Todd Smith says that. He absolutely could have hit him. And Aaron Farr. Aaron Farr is an important witness. The state submits as the last car to pass Mr. Bourgoin before the accident. If you listen to her testimony and listen to where she says she was and listen to the fact that she doesn't see the accident, she couldn't be where she pointed out on that map. She's farther down. And importantly, the accident reconstructionist will tell you, and she said in her testimony, that when she looked down and saw the car with the Volkswagen with the teenagers in it, there were two cars. There were two cars. Moments before the crash. But we haven't heard from anybody from that other car. Nobody reports being that other car. And you just saw on the video, there were a lot of cars there. There were a lot of cars there after the crash. But none of them, all the witnesses for the state, are folks that come upon the scene. There's nobody that says they were involved right there with the accident. That other car may have left. We may never know what happened to that other car, but Ms. Farr is very clear about it. When she passes the rest area, she sees the Volkswagen and another vehicle. Keith Porter says, I don't know what happened, I lost control. Seems like he's making up an excuse, right? But if you look at it through Mr. Bourgoin's eyes, that he's on a mission, he did lose control. He wasn't supposed to get in a crash. Now, Mr. Bourgoin has no memory of this conversation. If he was making this all up, if he had memories of all of this, why wouldn't he say, I came up the highway, I saw a guy, I thought he was from mission control, and I told him I lost control. He doesn't say that because he has absolutely no memory of that. And Sergeant Claffey gets to the scene going south. Somebody stole Shepard's car, and he goes after him down the hill. And what does he say? He says, I don't think the guy was trying to commit suicide because on the way back, he could have taken me out. And he didn't. Mr. Bourgoin, when he's driving the cruiser down the hill, there's no other cars on the highway. He thinks he's going the right way at first down the highway, but then thinks he's going the wrong way and turns around. And that's when he says, and that's when he's coming back up, continuing on his mission. Again, he's staying primarily in the right lane, and then when he comes back, he's going 100 miles an hour, and all the descriptions of the truck that's in the middle of the road are that it's a dark piece of metal sitting in the middle of the road. He's not aiming for it, he doesn't see it. He's not trying to hit it, he hits it. Trooper Miller, on scene, says that Mr. Bourgoin looks disoriented. Initially unable to say his name, 4 or 5 times to say that, and that he says one time when I was alone with him, that's when he tried to escape. You've all seen the videos of Mr. Bourgoin from a number of different angles on the side of the road that day. First of all, even if he's alone with Trooper Miller, without handcuffs, Trooper Miller is an armed police officer standing on top of him, essentially, with Mr. Bourgoin's got injuries, a broken hip, his head's all smashed up. Is he really trying to run away from a police officer at that point? He starts to get up, and he rolls, you see in the video, down, and is stopped almost immediately. The doctor who testified has him jumping up and sprinting away. It's clearly not what happened. Mr. Bourgoin tells the examiners that he's following the next command. He thinks he needs to go do the next thing. Evan Shagnon testified about hearing Officer DeFurio yelling things at Mr. Bourgoin, yelling not nice things at him. Now, there's no evidence that Mr. Bourgoin heard this, but it's what Mr. Bourgoin reports to the examiners, to the forensic examiners, about his experience at the hospital. Guards are calling him names. People are taking pictures of him. That's how he's being treated, the way that, and it's perfectly understandable and a natural response by Officer DeFurio, but it's what is occurring and it's what Mr. Bourgoin reports. It corroborates that. Amy Nolan and Dr. Bundock presented conclusive evidence that Mr. Bourgoin was wearing a seatbelt at the time of the crash. And so the question is someone suicidal going to be wearing a seatbelt? And then there's the accident reconstructionists. They talk about not a head-on collision, and they talk about the position of the cars, and they talk about what they believe happened. High-tech drive. So the position of the vehicles 5 seconds before the crash is essentially, according to, it seems, the evidence in the case, is essentially like that, right? Like two cars going down the road. And then, again, in kind of not pretending to be like the demonstration that you saw, essentially, Mr. Bourgoin car comes over here and then comes back into this direction, to the crash. That's essentially what happens. Again, remember, Aaron Farr saw two cars. So if the other car was here, passing the Jetta, would that explain Mr. Bourgoin's behavior and his driving? Trying to avoid cars, which is what he has told all the examiners. Any memory he has of driving, he seems to have it driving with the cruiser and not with driving with his vehicle, his truck. But all of his memory is trying to avoid things. And if the Volkswagen is in the driving in the travel lane, and Mr. Bourgoin is over in this lane, in the middle, we've got almost them coming head on. And so then, if Mr. Bourgoin's trying to avoid them, and they're trying to avoid Mr. Bourgoin, where do they end up? Our expert testified about fake left and where people can go. But if Mr. Bourgoin was trying to avoid a car that was as in his lane, that would explain things. Officer Shepard talks about there are lights in his vehicle. That's not the way you turn them off, but again, Mr. Bourgoin, it's very clear, his memory of what was going on with him is not clear. So that's the kind of the crash part. So let's talk a little bit about Mr. Bourgoin's history. I'm not going to go over it all with you, but in summary form, we know that Mr. Bourgoin's history and mental illness is not what Dr. Cotton testified to. I went through it all with you in my opening statement, and we called Anila Lawrence to talk about Mr. Bourgoin's mental status and his history of mood swings, his history of depression, his history of not being able to keep a job, his history of mental breakdowns, his history over time with somebody who is not his friend, not somebody who is going to be reporting things in order to help him. She's adverse to him. And testifying for her was extremely difficult. We all saw that. But she relates this history, this longitudinal history that Dr. Cotton doesn't seem to know anything about. But it's everything I said in opening statement is what was testified to with regard to Mr. Bourgoin's time from when Anila started seeing a change in Stephen in 2013, right down until October of 2016. They're happy at first, things are going on, they're fine, and then he's ambitious, he wants to go to grad school, he wants to get promotions, and then there's this change. And as we get into May of 2016, there's the assault on Ms. Lawrence, which must have been terrifying for her and minimized by Mr. Bourgoin. But the result of that is he's totally barred from seeing his daughter. He can't see her at all. And so what does he do? Does he go off the deep end? Does he become rageful? Does he become suicidal? Does he call her up all the time? Does he try to see her anyway? No. He follows the order. He goes to court, files a parentage action, because that's what he wanted. He wanted to establish legal parentage because he was worried that Ms. Lawrence might try to do something and he didn't have any legal right to his child. And so he goes and he does that, he gets that established, and then he goes to court again to try to get visitation, and he isn't happy with the amount of visitation he's granted, but that's what the judge said, and they're going to come back in 60 days. And so he goes to his first visit on October 1st. And then he has that visit, and it's bittersweet. It is bittersweet. He texts that to Ms. Kosovic. You'll see that in the text messages. But he's happy that he's reestablished. You'll see in the text messages with Ms. Kosovic, he's happy that he's starting to reestablish his relationship with his daughter. And you will see that after this, again, if you look, I asked Detective Crick whether or not in looking at the text messages, whether she saw a change over the week. You will have those text messages. You will have them all printed out in one of the exhibits. You will see, as you look through those, there's a distinct change over the course of the week. In the beginning, he's talking to Asima all the time, and then it steadily drops off till Thursday or Friday. He's not texting with her at all. This is the person he texts with all the time. What he's doing is he's starting on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday with this blogging, with this internet research. He's on his phone. He's primarily on his phone, and he's doing all sorts of research. And this is when he starts to get confused at first. Then he starts to get these ideas of reference, and then he starts to become more psychotic as we go through the week. Again, this is what Dr. Kapoor and Dr. Rosemarin say are the typical presentation of folks who are becoming psychotic. It doesn't come on all at once. It just comes on kind of slowly. There's some confusion, and then after a while, you start to have moments of delusion that you are confused about at first, and then as it goes through the week, he starts to get more psychotic, and he gets excited about it at first, and he's kind of off to the races come Wednesday or so. And again, he's not saying he's hearing voices. He's not saying that he is getting commands even. He's saying things are speaking to him. And then he starts to go out on these drives. We've got documented drives on Thursday and Friday by Cy Ray. He shows what Mr. Bourgoin is doing, and that Mr. Bourgoin is saying he's getting commands, or he's getting ideas of which way to go from his car radio. Turn this way, turn that way, the songs and the rhythm. He eventually gets to the point where he thinks he's being selected to some type of government mission, that he's going to have a test, and that these are kind of breadcrumbs that have been left along the way. Remember, he talks about his passport being important to him, that he's going to need that. So Thursday night into Friday, he's not sleeping at all, but he doesn't feel fatigued, he reports. He's feeling energetic, bolder, excited. He thinks actually this is his dream come true, and this connects back to his bitter disappointment from not being able to stay in the military. And then at work on Thursday and Friday, he starts seeing things in the invoices. The invoices are starting to talk to him. There's names and patterns in there that pertain to him. And here he then starts to get scared. Doesn't know whether this is excitement and this is really happening, or if he should be scared. And so then on Friday, he reaches the point where he has to leave for work, intending to come back. Again, he says he goes for this ride down to Heinsberg, and we know that from Cy Ray, he does. He heads down Route 116. He doesn't make it all the way to Heinsberg. He makes it to the Shelburne Pond area of St. George, but it's verified by Cy Ray. And that eventually he's talking to Chris Fabian at Lake Champlain Chocolates, and he quits. And again, that conversation is while he's driving. He's in the car. This is bizarre behavior. This person who the state has painted as somebody desperate about his finances, in complete fear of being foreclosed on, not being able to pay his gas bill, ups and quits his job on Friday for no good reason at all. And then we have Friday night at the farm. When you listen to what Stephen Bourgoin says on Friday night, something that is documented and recorded in November of 2016 in an interview with Ms. Kiley, and then again he repeats it with Dr. Cotton. There's no way of understanding that unless Mr. Bourgoin is psychotic, delusional, and paranoid. We know that from Cy Ray's work that he went out driving around 5:45 in the evening, and then he went to McDonald's, and he texted apply. And we can reasonably infer that he saw a sign at McDonald's that said text apply. And so he did that. And then we know for certain that he went driving around and ended up at a dirt ended up off a dirt road on a farm. We know that because Cy Ray tells us that's where he ended up. He got there 8:30 or so, and he's there for an hour. And then his phone is never heard from again. And we know that there's a sign on the edge of the field, one of those fields, with a number for 1-800 New England Organics, whatever their phone number is. It's the phone number that's found that he called during the period of time that he was out there by the river. We know that when we take Detective Crick's evidence collected and Cy Ray's evidence presented, that he's out there. Now, all of this only makes sense through the eyes of psychotic Stephen Bourgoin. There's no reasonable explanation for any of this behavior other than what Mr. Bourgoin tells you. You can't make this up. No one could. It doesn't even make sense to try. He went to a field and called a sign, threw his phone in the river before he went into a crash in a suicidal rage because he thought maybe if he survived the crash, he'd have to claim the insanity defense. That's not what happened. The only explanation is that Stephen Bourgoin was psychotic, and he's telling you what he did and why. So was there a police investigation to show who Mr. Bourgoin was really calling on Friday night? They had their theory. This is suicidal rage because he's depressed about his finances and his child. And they looked at all the evidence through that lens. It's called confirmation bias. It occurs when a person believes in or searches for evidence in support of his or her favorite theory while ignoring or excusing disconfirmatory evidence and disinclined to change his or her belief once he or she arrives at a conclusion. So what happened when we did just the opposite? When we investigated the facts and let them lead us to whatever we might find. And so I'm going to take you through the example of the New England Organics phone number, because it is really quite an unbelievable story. I'm sure you picked up on this. So let's start with what Mr. Bourgoin said about Friday night. He's down by the river on his phone communicating with government agencies and trying to follow signs to get the right direction. He's alternating between excitement and terror. But then we have these phone records that say he called Casella Customer Service. That's what Detective Crick said. But then, if you notice in Cy Ray's report, it says New England Organics, not Casella Customer Service for that same phone number. And it is the number for New England Organics. So, down at the farm, last week, there's a meeting with the farmer, and what does he tell us? Yeah, I spread New England compost on my cornfield back in the fall of 2016. And by the way, I posted signs all along the way, and then signs had the 800 Organics number on it. And actually, I still have some of those signs down in my office. This is when you look at what Mr. Bourgoin said, which was, I was calling numbers on my phone. And you say, let's go see where he got this number from. He says he got it when he was out down by the river, down in a field. And you go down to the field, and you find that, yeah, that number was sitting right there on a post. The state didn't figure that out, even though Cy Ray had identified it in his report. Carrie Crick didn't know what it was. Ms. Harden put that number up on a big poster when she was trying to show you that he was making calls that had to do with finances or finances primarily, that she made a list of. Things she was trying to say, look, he's making rational calls along the way. she puts the New England Organics number up on there. He calls the New England Organics number because he sees it in the middle of the field when he's running around, psychotic, thinking he's on some type of government mission. It's the only explanation for that. So let's look back at the timeline for Friday night through Mr. Bourgoin's perspective. He calls Todd Taylor. Again, the state's theory is this is some type of foreclosure person. Well, that's an 800 number. We know he's in the car by Cy Ray's report. We know he's in the car at 5:43 in the afternoon when he calls that number. We know Todd Taylor plays radio ads with 800 number in it. Is that really the time, a Friday afternoon at 5:43, he's going to be making a consultation with Todd Taylor? Then he's at McDonald's. And again, we know that from Cy Ray's work. He's stationary at McDonald's for a period of time. And who told him to go to McDonald's? Remember in the testimony, Alan Kosovic says, hey, maybe you should just go to McDonald's if you're unhappy with your job. And who does Mr. Bourgoin by this point think is in on it? He thinks Mr. Kosovic is somehow in on all of this. And then he's there at McDonald's and he sees a sign. And it says, text apply. And so what does he do? He text apply. If you look at the rest of the calls and the rest of the texts for the end of that Friday night, he's calling Alabama Reaper. He's making other random phone calls. And then what is he doing at the hospital on Saturday morning? He's looking at signs and taking down numbers. He's first discovered in the secure portion of the hospital, looking at a poster of a lost sweatshirt. And then he's out in the common area asking the security guard for the phone number off of a poster on a wall. Now, he doesn't have his phone, so he needs a piece of paper to write it down with. Nothing explains Friday night except for Mr. Bourgoin being psychotic. Dr. Cotton's explanation of Friday night, he didn't talk about Friday night at all. Didn't mention it. Didn't mention it in his direct testimony, didn't mention it in his cross, didn't mention it. Don't know whether he even really remembers it. In between the farm and the hospital, Mr. Bourgoin says he's up all night. We know he's out and about. We hear that from his neighbor, Homeland Security guy, who's listening, hearing him. Plenty of time to go to Montpelier and back after he destroys his phone. At 4 a.m., we know he is at the Kosovic's house. Again, totally confused, disoriented. They want him to stay, but he goes. Again, the only thing he's kind of forward thinking about is his visit he's got with Izzy. He's looking forward to that in the morning at 8. And they text him, Alan Kosovic texts him, of course, a text he never gets, I hope you feel better. By Saturday morning, Mr. Bourgoin is totally confused and delusional. He thinks that maybe they're out to get him, maybe to hurt Anua, maybe to hurt Izzy. He's got this 10 o'clock meeting, which is very important to him, at the gymnastics. Again, Dr. Cotton didn't even remember that that was coming up. And he needs to try to make all of this stop. He needs to try to be able to be safe. He can't go see Izzy like this. So he goes to the hospital. And again, he shows up first, and he's found inside the secure portion of the emergency department. He hasn't checked in. He's looking at a sign for a sweatshirt. And this is totally bizarre behavior. And then he's found in the hospital in this state, and he's looking at another sign and asking for it to be written down. You saw the video of that and Security Officer Miller talking about it. This is not somebody who's in some type of rageful, suicidal state. It's somebody who's confused, disoriented, and not being able to really explain what he's doing there. So then he just leaves. And you saw the video. He leaves and he kind of just sits in his truck for a while. He just doesn't go anywhere. He's now still got time to go see Izzy, 10 o'clock, it's 8:44 or so, but he doesn't. He can't. Drives around for a while, drives back to the hospital. This time he does come in and check in. Again, he's coded as crisis. Certainly know that something is going on with Mr. Bourgoin. And he meets with the triage nurse, where he talks about anxiety. He can't talk about what's going on. He can't talk about the mission, about the delusions. He says, I'm having relationship issues, but I just want to be somewhere safe. And he can't even understand the pain chart. And again, that he just wants to be somewhere safe. And he walks to remember this testimony, he walks from the triage area to the emergency room. And Nurse Poland is convinced he has two people along the way he must have known because he started talking with them. He didn't know anybody in the ER. You heard the psychiatrist Kennedy talk about folks that are in an altered state. They just want to talk to everybody. You can't keep them in the room. He doesn't know anybody. He's thinking and communicating with people randomly in the hospital. And again, then he goes into a room. He's there with the nurse, and the nurse talks with him. He doesn't want his clothes to be separated from him. Again, his passport is with the clothes. He's guarded. He is, again, just wanting to be somewhere safe. But he does change at some point. He gets in his scrubs. He gets a warm blanket. He gets on a gurney, and he's safe. He's got that little bit of safeness now. He's away from everything. Then the PA comes in and does the exam, and during that exam, doesn't really have any complaints other than what was just talked about. Doesn't really make any sense why he's there. And she basically talks to him and says, you can either, be in the hospital or you can leave. And he doesn't want to be in the hospital. He just wants to stay somewhere safe. So she says, well, then we're going to discharge you. And she goes to write up the discharge paperwork, and before even the nurse can get back to talk to him, he's gone. Now it's 11 o'clock. He's missed his visit with Izzy. And he's been up for days driving around, and his memory here is vague about coming home from the hospital. He believes he may have fallen asleep. He thinks he fell asleep down on the couch because he wanted to be able to see if anybody was coming. He was scared they were coming for him. But then he remembers going out and driving again. And he remembers driving down Route 2, heading to Richmond. Again, he's getting direction from the radio, signaling with speeds up and down. He's in the Richmond park and ride, noticing the cameras, vague memory of getting on the interstate, no memory of turning around on the highway, thinks he's going the right way. You heard what he told Dr. Cotton. He thinks he's going the right way. Has no idea he's going the wrong way. Swerves at the last minute to avoid a collision. He remembers the crash and feeling of coming to. He realizes he's been in a crash. He runs down the car, and he's absolutely delusional and psychotic, and he sees things that aren't there. He looks in the car. He's delusional. He's psychotic, and he thinks he sees mannequins, and he goes from there. Now again, Dr. Cotton, when trying to explain this, when asked about it by Ms. George, and again, I'm sure you picked up on this, what did he see when he opened the door? Couldn't remember. Couldn't remember the most bizarre thing that Mr. Bourgoin said about this entire incident. Now we know he has a good memory, Dr. Cotton, for when he wants to remember things. He sat in on Friday without a note and recited social history, the entire social history from Mr. Bourgoin's time with him. And I asked him today, did he give, most of the social history? And he said, yes, he did. And that was 3 pages. Basically recited it. The entire time that Dr. Cotton spent with Mr. Bourgoin on the offense conduct was 2 pages, so less than that amount of time. So in his mind, Mr. Bourgoin's mind, this is a setup. He thinks that this is still part of that test, and he looks up and sees blue lights, and he thinks that's another sign. He follows those lights because he thinks the car has been planted there. Again, he doesn't have a memory, much memory after that. Again, he thinks, we went through this in some detail with Dr. Rosemarin, but he tells Dr. Rosemarin he thinks as he's driving down the hill, remember there's no other cars on the highway at this point, he sees the lights up ahead, and at some point he thinks he's going the wrong way. So he turns around and starts heading back up the hill, and now what he thinks is the right way. And again, does he run into Sergeant Claffey's car if he's trying to kill himself? No, he avoids Sergeant Claffey's car. And he continues to go straight. This time he's really going to do the mission right. He's going to get there. He's going 100 miles an hour, and he doesn't see his truck, which has no lights and has a hunk of metal in the middle of the road. And again, he remembers then a female. He remembers trying to go to the next thing in the mission when he's hurt and on the ground, but then he remembers somebody who looks like his neighbor. He feels safe with her. And again, we have the confirmation. It's not his memory. It's not what he remembers happening, but it's the ambulance driver's memory of Mr. Bourgoin making comments to her like he knew her in the ambulance. So what about all the evidence from after the crashes? First, we know he's in a serious car accident, 2 car accidents. He's got a head injury, hip injury, goes into a coma, has seizures, gets medication. He's essentially out of it for 2 or 3 days. And when he finally comes to, he's confused and disoriented. He's not cooperative. He's evasive. He's not answering questions. At one point, Dr. Rosemarin thinks it might be another seizure, but at one point, the only time he's uncooperative is he's swatting at nurses and spitting at them at some point. So it's unclear what's going on there. But you heard the physiatrist tell you that he was a model patient. He was not cooperative in providing information with regard to what was going on in his head. And whether he was psychotic or not during that period of time after the accidents only goes to a determination about whether Dr. Rosemarin is right, and this is bipolar, or Dr. Kapoor is right, and this is a personality disorder. That's where being psychotic matters. There's a time period you need to be psychotic. Dr. Rosemarin thinks he sees evidence in it for 30 days, including after the DOC. Dr. Kapoor doesn't see that evidence and disagrees with that. And that is why whether he's psychotic or not matters. It doesn't matter for either of their conclusions that he was psychotic at the time of the accident. Both of them clearly say that you can't look at how he was doing after the accident and decide what was going on before the accident. Now, Dr. Cotton, who is, in a real sense of the word, the state's doctor, it's not a psychiatrist interested in a psychiatric investigation. into what was really going on in Stephen Bourgoin's mind. I think that was clearly on evidence today. It's still completely unclear what Dr. Cotton thinks happened. He certainly didn't give an opinion that he was suicidal. He didn't give an opinion that he was rageful. He says, without really any explanation, there's no data to support bipolar, there's no data to support personality disorder. And then he offers what I would suggest is a conclusory opinion about Mr. Bourgoin being unable to conform his conduct or appreciate his actions. The testimony you heard, there was never an explanation by Dr. Cotton of why he came to that conclusion. He just said, that's what it is. This is my opinion. He doesn't want to find him insane, so he doesn't. That's understandable, but it's not the law. He never gave an opinion about what he thinks was going on in Stephen Bourgoin's mind at the time of the crash. Not in his draft report, not in his final report, not in his deposition, not in his testimony. Compare that, please. Compare that with what you heard from Drs. Rosemarin and Dr. Kapoor. They did thorough and extensive and exhaustive reviews of the materials. They did hours and hours and hours of examinations with Stephen Bourgoin. They consulted with other experts. They called in Dr. Lucas, Dr. Baranowski. And when they came here and testified and told you about their investigation and about their opinions, they told you what they thought was going on in Mr. Bourgoin's mind on the night of the crash. And most importantly, how and why they came to their conclusions. They laid it all out for you. And Dr. Kapoor told you she came into this case highly skeptical. Story just didn't seem plausible. But then she did the work, the hard work, of being a top-tier forensic psychiatrist. That's why they hired her. And she came to the opinion that Mr. Bourgoin was insane at the time of the crash. Think how hard that must have been for her. Ms. George had hired her to assist in the case. How difficult it must have been for her on that January day to walk into her office and tell her, sorry, I think he's insane. And why did they hire Dr. Kapoor? They didn't want to rely upon Dr. Cotton. They already had Dr. Cotton's report. Sorry. Stay organized here. They already had Dr. Cotton's report. That's high enough for everybody to see the report. Again, Dr. Cotton's report was in December of 2016. They had Dr. Cotton. They got Dr. Rosemarin's report. And then they hired Dr. Kapoor. So you've got Dr. Cotton. Dr. Cotton is a top tier, good to rely on. I'll put money on him. Doctor, why are they going out and hiring Dr. Kapoor? They didn't want to rely on Dr. Cotton. And they picked their person. And they picked their person, and she did an excellent job. She did 14 hours of interviews. She called in Dr. Baranowski. It was quite impressive. Dr. Baranowski's testing supported Dr. Kapoor's findings, that it was borderline, that was a personality disorder. Dr. Baranowski testified to you it's not just I'm testing on that day, I'm testing, and that this psychological profile endures over time. So if he is testing as personality disorder now, borderline personality disorder now, he would have been borderline personality disorder back then. And when do they retain Dr. Cotton? Do they get him on board thinking, boy, we'll get him on board after Dr. Rosemary, we could have Dr. Cotton and Dr. Kapoor. They don't do that. They don't want Dr. Cotton in here. But they're stuck with him because it's February 4th, 2019. If Dr. Cotton said, yes, the case was coming to litigation. Talk a little bit about another aspect of this case, which is diminished capacity. And one of the things you're going to have to determine in your deliberations is this has the state proven second-degree murder or what's called a lesser included offense of involuntary manslaughter. And they'll be defined to you, but in essence, the difference between the two is what was going on in the person's mind, okay? And so you're going to have to try to figure that out. You'll get a jury instruction with regard to diminished capacity that will lay that all out for you. And and you'll get a jury instruction about what the difference is. What's the difference between second-degree murder and involuntary manslaughter? Both involve an unlawful killing, but they are separated by essentially the level of risk undertaken by the person and whether the person consciously disregarded a wanton disregard for the value of human life, that would be second-degree murder, or they failed to appreciate the dangerousness of what they did when they should have. That's kind of, the jury instructions for the court will be what apply, but that's essentially it. When you are considering this, you are allowed to consider the mental state and the mental condition of Mr. Bourgoin. Now this is completely and separate and apart from insanity. That's a whole different thing. I'll try to, I think we talked about this a little in voir dire, but so that's one of the things you're going to have to do. Now we know that from the insanity definitions, and we've been over those, that there has to be what's called a mental disease or defect. And we talked a lot about those. It may be that that's not an issue in this case anymore based upon Dr. Cotton's testimony, but for diminished capacity, that it's any mental condition. So even if you don't think it's a mental disease according to the statute, if it's a mental condition that stopped Mr. Bourgoin from consciously disregarding a wanton disregard for the value of human life, then you would have to not find him guilty of second-degree murder and instead find him guilty of involuntary manslaughter. So diminished capacity is something different than insanity. So I want to talk about diminished capacity for just a second. I think even if you just took Dr. Cotton's testimony about what his final findings were about Mr. Bourgoin, that was a mental condition that would have stopped him from forming the specific intent of wanton disregard for the value of conscious disregard and a wanton disregard. And that at most, that Mr. Bourgoin would be found not guilty of second-degree murder, and we'd be looking at a conviction for involuntary manslaughter. If there's a conviction of either, though, either second-degree murder or involuntary manslaughter, that's when you have to determine whether or not Mr. Bourgoin was insane at the time. When I say conviction, I mean finding all the elements. So before you even get to the insanity portion of your deliberations, you're going to first have to decide whether or not the state is met by beyond a reasonable doubt. And here, it's not, the burden is on the defendant when we're talking about insanity. Here, where we're talking about wanton disregard or not, it's the state's burden to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that he was acting with a conscious disregard for the value of human life, wanton disregard. The state has to prove that beyond a reasonable doubt. If they fail to do that, in the beginning, then you're down to an involuntary manslaughter conviction, and then, or finding of involuntary manslaughter, and then you would move on to determine whether or not you thought there was even more there, and that that we, the defense, has proven by a preponderance of evidence that he in fact was insane at the time. So that's a little bit of a roadmap of how things go in your deliberations, and the court will give you the instructions. They're 22 pages, and you'll get them and you'll be able to review them. But I would ask you to keep in mind that the analysis to begin with is, has the state met their burden beyond a reasonable doubt, presuming Mr. Bourgoin innocent, because between the two, second degree and involuntary manslaughter, the court will instruct you, there's a presumption that it's the lesser. You know, if you're looking at the two and saying, hey, which one is this? Which one is it? Is it involuntary or is it second degree? You're supposed to start with, well, let's presume it's involuntary and see whether the government has met its burden to get it up to second degree. So then you would move to the insanity defense. And here, if there's a conviction on either second degree or involuntary manslaughter, then you would move to the insanity defense. And we've been over the prongs of the insanity defense. I'm sure you maybe have them memorized by now. But it's our burden to prove by what's called a preponderance of the evidence both of these prongs. And preponderance of the evidence, again, is 1 grain of sand more than 50%. It's not beyond a reasonable doubt. It's more likely than not. 50.0001%. I think the evidence is much more than that. You heard Dr. Kapoor and Dr. Rosemarin, and you can try to get through Dr. Cotton's testimony, but I believe they're all saying that something was going on with Mr. Bourgoin, and that it rose to the level of a mental disease during these couple of days, and specifically on Saturday, October 8th, 2016. And so then the question is, could he either appreciate the criminality of his conduct or conform his conduct to the requirements of law? And again, you've got Dr. Cotton's conclusory statements that he could, without any real foundation. And then you have Dr. Kapoor and Dr. Rosemarin's eloquent, thorough, and recitations of why they don't think he is, why they thought he was psychotic at the time, how he got to be psychotic, how this presented as a typical pattern that they see of psychosis coming on, that they looked at the digital evidence, they looked at the collateral interviews, they reviewed everything from the doctors at UVM, from before the accident and after the accident. They reviewed all the statements that were sent to them where people were saying things about Mr. Bourgoin, and they continued to look at that, and particularly Dr. Kapoor really challenged herself and challenged Mr. Bourgoin with that evidence, and found that the evidence was that he was psychotic at the time. And if he was psychotic at the time, he couldn't appreciate the criminality of his conduct, and he couldn't conform his conduct to the requirements of law. I don't think it's just by a preponderance of the evidence. I think the evidence overwhelmingly shows, and in fact, there's no contrary evidence certainly not from any medical doctor, that he was not insane at the time of the offense, and we would ask you to find him so. Thank you.